A child born in southern Spain in 1881 would witness the invention of the airplane, survive 2 world wars, and live to see humans walk on the moon. Pablo Picasso experienced all of this. But more remarkably, he didn't just witness the 20th century, he invented large portions of it. The city of Malaga clings to the Mediterranean coast of Andalusia, where Africa nearly touches Europe. In October of 1881, it was a place of whitewashed buildings, fishing boats, and the endless sound of waves. Don José Ruiz Blasco, a mediocre painter who taught drawing at the local art school, lived there with his wife, Maria Picasso Lopez. Their first child arrived on October 25th during an earthquake. The midwife thought the baby was stillborn. He lay silent and grey on the table until his uncle, a physician who smoked cigars, leaned over and blew smoke into the infant's face. The child gasped, screamed, and began to breathe. They named him Pablo Diego José Francisco de Paula Juan Nepomuceno, María de los Remedios, Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad, Ruiz y Picasso. 13 names for a boy who would eventually sign his work with just one, Picasso. His mother's surname, not his father's. Even in this small act of choosing a name, he was already rewriting the rules. Don José painted pigeons, the same subject over and over, with competent technique but no vision. He earned barely enough to support his family. The apartment was small, the money tight, but there were brushes and paints and canvas. Pablo's earliest memory wasn't of a toy or a game. It was of wanting to draw. By age 7, he could render a pigeon more convincingly than his father. This wasn't the clumsy charm of a child's drawing. It was technical mastery that shouldn't have been possible. Don José would begin a painting, and Pablo would finish it. The father's hand and the son's hand, indistinguishable on the canvas. When Pablo was 10, the family moved north to La Coruña on the Atlantic coast. Don José had found a position at another art school. It was a grimmer city, rainier, colder. The light that had flooded their Malaga home disappeared behind endless grey skies. But something else was disappearing too. Don José's own talent, whatever small flame had once existed, was guttering out. He could feel it, and he could see that his son possessed something he never had. The story goes that one day, Don José was working on a painting of pigeons when he left the room. Pablo, 13 years old, picked up the brush and completed the bird's feet. When Don José returned and saw what his son had done, he stared at the canvas for a long time. Then he handed Pablo his palette and brushes. He would never paint again. Whether this moment happened exactly as described or has been embellished into legend doesn't matter. What matters is the truth it contains. Don José recognized that his son had surpassed him, not just in skill, but in some fundamental way that couldn't be taught. The father gave up painting so the son could begin. Barcelona, 1895. The family moved again, this time to Catalonia's capital, a city that actually mattered. Don José secured a teaching position at La Llotja, the prestigious School of Fine Arts. Admission required an entrance exam that typically took students a month to complete. Pablo finished it in a day. He was 14 years old, studying alongside men in their 20s. The curriculum was rigorous: classical training, drawing from plaster casts, copying the masters, anatomy, perspective, technique, technique, technique. Pablo absorbed it all instantly and found it crushingly boring. He'd already mastered these skills. What he wanted was something else, though he couldn't yet name what. The studio his father rented for him became a refuge. While La Llotja taught the approved methods of the past, Pablo was looking at everything happening in the present. Magazines arrived from Paris showing work by painters whose names meant nothing in Barcelona, but would soon mean everything. Toulouse-Lautrec, Degas, the Impressionists. They were breaking rules Pablo hadn't even learned yet. His early work from this period is startling because it's so accomplished and so conventional. Academic paintings that could hang in any museum, portraits with perfect technique, compositions that followed every rule. He could paint like the old masters before he was 16. This is crucial to understand. Everything that came later, all the distortions and abstractions and violations of traditional form, he did those things because he chose to, not because he couldn't paint properly. He demolished the rules from the inside as someone who'd mastered them completely. But Barcelona, for all its sophistication compared to Malaga or La Coruña, was still provincial. There was only one place for a serious artist. Everyone knew it. Don José knew it. Pablo knew it. Paris. In October 1900, Pablo Picasso boarded a train with his friend, Carles Casagemas. They were both 19 years old. Neither spoke French. They had almost no money. And they were going to the centre of the art world. The city where reputations were made and destroyed weekly. Where more artists were starving in garrets than were actually selling paintings. Where the only thing more plentiful than ambition was failure. The train rattled north through France. Pablo stared out the window at a landscape he'd only seen in paintings. Somewhere during that journey, the provincial Spanish boy began the transformation into the artist who would dominate the century. But the cost of that transformation was about to become clear in the most devastating way possible. Montmartre rose above Paris like a village perched on a hill, which is exactly what it had been before the city swallowed it. By 1900, it was the neighbourhood where artists lived, because they couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Narrow streets climbed past cabarets and brothels, studios carved from attic spaces, the massive white dome of Sacré-Cœur still under construction at the summit. This is where Pablo and Casagemas found a studio to share. Everything was new. The language, the food, the light, the sheer density of humanity. Barcelona had felt like a real city compared to Malaga. Paris made Barcelona look like a market town. 4 million people lived here. Artists from every country in Europe converged on Montmartre. Galleries, salons, critics who could make or break a career with a single review. Pablo threw himself into the chaos. He explored the Louvre, stood in front of paintings he'd only seen as reproductions, studied the old masters with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He sketched constantly, filling notebooks with faces from the street, dancers from the Moulin Rouge, prostitutes from the brothels that lined the boulevards. His style was shifting, loosening, absorbing influences from everywhere at once. But Casagemas was struggling. He'd fallen in love with a model named Germaine Pichot. She didn't love him back. The rejection consumed him. Pablo watched his friend spiral into depression, tried to help, failed. In late December, they left Paris together, heading to Malaga for Christmas. It was supposed to be a temporary retreat, a chance for Casagemas to recover. It didn't work. On February 17th, 1901, in a Paris restaurant, Carles Casagemas invited friends to dinner. Germaine was there. Near the end of the meal, Casagemas stood up, pulled out a revolver, and shot at Germaine. He missed. Then he turned the gun on himself. He didn't miss. Pablo was in Madrid when he heard the news. He'd known Casagemas since Barcelona, had shared the first Paris adventure with him, had tried to save him from the darkness. And now his friend was dead at 20, killed by a love that wasn't returned, destroyed by the same city that Pablo was determined to conquer. The death hit him with physical force. For weeks, he couldn't work. When he finally returned to his canvas, everything had changed. The colours drained away. The bright Spanish palette he'd brought to Paris disappeared. What replaced it was blue. Not the cheerful blue of Mediterranean skies. A deep, cold blue that seemed to come from underwater or from some place where light barely reached. The blue period had begun, though no one called it that yet. Pablo didn't announce he was starting a new phase. He just started painting in blue and couldn't stop. The subjects were beggars, prostitutes, prisoners, the blind, the poor, the forgotten. Everyone who lived in the shadows of the city that was supposed to be the city of light. He painted them with a tenderness that his earlier work had never shown, but also with an unflinching honesty about suffering. These weren't sentimental portraits of noble poverty. They were documents of what it meant to have nothing. Critics hated it. Collectors wouldn't buy it. The paintings were too depressing, too stark, too blue. Why would anyone want such misery on their walls? Pablo didn't care. Or rather, he cared desperately about the work, and not at all about the market's response. He was 20 years old and painting like someone who'd seen everything and lost most of it. He shuttled between Paris and Barcelona, never quite settling in either place. In Paris, he was a Spanish artist trying to break into a scene that had no use for another foreigner with ambitions. In Barcelona, he was the one who'd been to Paris and come back changed, no longer quite fitting into the world he'd left behind. Money was a constant problem. He sold drawings for a few francs when he could. He traded paintings for meals. His friend, Jaime Sabartes, who would later become his secretary, remembered Pablo during this period as gaunt, obsessed, working in freezing studios without heat, stretching the same canvas multiple times because he couldn't afford new ones. Some of his blue period paintings exist on top of earlier work that he simply painted over. The blue paintings kept coming. Old guitarist with gnarled hands. La Vie, a massive canvas about the cycle of life and death, with Casa James's face appearing like a ghost. The Tragedy, a family huddled together against some unnamed catastrophe. Every canvas seemed to be asking the same question. What do we do with suffering? How do we live with loss? But something else was happening beneath the blue. Pablo was learning to distort form in service of emotion. Bodies became elongated, angular, sculptural. He was moving away from pure representation towards something more expressive. The technical mastery was still there, but now it was being bent to purposes that had nothing to do with traditional beauty. By 1904, he'd moved to Paris permanently. The city had killed his friend, but it was also the only place where the art he needed to make could exist. He found a studio at 13 Rue Ravignan, in a ramshackle building locales called the Bateau Lavoir because it swayed like a boat. The studio had no heat, no running water, and cost 15 francs a month. He would live there for 5 years. The blue was starting to fade, not all at once, but gradually, like someone's eyes adjusting to light after years in darkness. Rose tones began appearing, warmer colours. His subjects shifted from the destitute to circus performers, acrobats, harlequins. There was still melancholy in these paintings, but also grace, movement, possibility. He'd met a woman named Fernande Olivier. She was a model, beautiful in the classical sense, with dark eyes and an oval face. More importantly, she was intelligent, independent, and completely unimpressed by artistic temperament. They became lovers. For the first time since Casagemas's death, Pablo seemed capable of something other than mourning. The Rose period, as it would be called, lasted roughly 2 years. The paintings from this time have an otherworldly quality, as if the circus performers exist in some space between reality and dream. Families of acrobats, young boys leading horses, harlequins standing alone. The loneliness is still present, but it's a different kind of loneliness. Less about despair, more about isolation, the sense of being separate from the ordinary world. Critics still weren't buying it. His dealer, Ambroise Vollard, would eventually purchase most of the blue and rose period paintings, but for prices that barely kept Pablo fed. He was becoming known in certain circles, but known as what? A talented Spanish painter with a depressing vision and an unwillingness to paint things people actually wanted? What no one understood yet was that Pablo wasn't trying to please anyone. He was trying to solve a problem that most people didn't even know existed. How do you paint truth? Not the surface appearance of things, but the truth underneath. How do you show what a face really is, not just what it looks like from one angle in one moment? These questions were about to lead him somewhere nobody expected, somewhere that would fracture reality itself and rebuild it according to new laws. But first he needed to see something that would change everything. A mask. In 1906, Pablo walked into an exhibition that would detonate his entire understanding of art. The Trocadero Ethnographic Museum in Paris had a collection of African masks and sculptures, objects that most Europeans dismissed as primitive curiosities. Pablo saw something else entirely. The masks weren't trying to look like faces. They were trying to be faces, distilled to their essential geometry. A face reduced to planes and angles, eyes that didn't need pupils to see, mouths that didn't need lips to speak. These weren't representations, they were presences. Western art, since the Renaissance, had been obsessed with one question: how do we make a flat surface look like three-dimensional space? The answer involved perspective, shading, proportion, all the techniques Pablo had mastered by age 14. But the African sculptors had asked a different question entirely. How do we make an object contain spiritual power? They carved forms that existed outside normal space and time, multiple viewpoints compressed into a single face, features rearranged according to symbolic importance rather than anatomical accuracy. The result was something that felt more real than realism, more present than any naturalistic portrait could be. Pablo understood immediately. He'd been trying to paint emotional truth using the wrong tools. Perspective was a trap. It locked you into seeing things from one position at one moment. But human experience isn't like that. When you think about someone's face, you don't remember it from a single angle. You remember it as a composite of every time you've seen it, every emotion it's expressed, the way it looks in your mind, which is nothing like the way it looks in a mirror. What if you could paint that? Not the face as it appears, but the face as it's experienced? He returned to his studio and began working on something unprecedented, a painting that would take 9 months and hundreds of preparatory sketches. A painting that would change art forever, and that almost nobody would understand for decades. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. 5 nude women, but women like nothing anyone had painted before. Their bodies are angular, geometric, assembled from planes that seem to shift and reconfigure as you look at them. Some faces are rendered with African mask-like features. Others are more naturalistic but still distorted, broken into facets. The space they occupy is impossible. There's no coherent perspective. Foreground and background compress into each other. Bodies overlap in ways that violate every rule of representation. And yet the painting has tremendous power. A raw confrontational energy that makes traditional nudes look decorative and safe. His friends hated it. Georges Braque, who would become his closest collaborator, said it was like drinking kerosene. Matisse thought Pablo was mocking modern art. Even his dealer Vollard refused to show it. The painting would remain rolled up in Pablo's studio for years, seen by only a handful of people. But Pablo knew he'd found something. The painting was clumsy in places, not fully resolved. The different styles within it didn't quite cohere, but the principle was sound. You could fragment reality and reassemble it according to new rules. You could show multiple viewpoints simultaneously. You could paint not what you see, but what you know. Braque came back. After his initial revulsion, something about the painting had lodged in his mind. He began making his own experiments, paintings of landscapes and buildings broken into geometric planes, colours reduced to browns and greys to emphasise form over decoration. In 1908, a critic reviewing Braque's work used a dismissive phrase: "He reduces everything to little cubes." The name stuck, Cubism. For the next 7 years, Pablo and Braque worked in obsessive parallel, pushing each other toward increasingly radical solutions. They would visit each other's studios daily, critiquing, suggesting, stealing ideas back and forth until sometimes they couldn't remember who had thought of what first. Pablo later said they were like 2 mountaineers roped together. The progression was rapid and systematic. First, analytical cubism, where objects were broken down into fragments and reassembled from multiple angles simultaneously. A guitar wasn't painted from one side, but from all sides at once. as if you could walk around it while looking at a flat canvas. Time collapsed into space. The fourth dimension flattened into the second. They stopped using traditional shading and perspective. Instead, they indicated space through overlapping planes, through the way forms intersected and interrupted each other. The colour palettes became almost monochromatic, browns, greys, ochres, because colour was a distraction from the structural revolution they were attempting. Critics were baffled. The public was hostile. These didn't look like paintings. They looked like puzzles, like visual chaos. Where was the beauty? Where was the skill? Anyone could splash fragments across a canvas, except they couldn't. What Pablo and Braque were doing required absolute mastery of form. You had to understand traditional representation completely before you could systematically dismantle it. The fragments weren't random. Every plane, every line, every intersection was calculated to create a new kind of spatial coherence. By 1912, they'd pushed analytical cubism as far as it could go. The paintings had become so fragmented, so abstract, that you could barely identify the objects depicted. A violin looked like a geometric explosion. A face dissolved into shifting planes. So they moved to the next phase, synthetic cubism. Instead of breaking objects down, they would build them up. They began incorporating real materials into their paintings: newspaper clippings, wallpaper, pieces of fabric. The paintings became assemblages, collages, three-dimensional objects that existed between painting and sculpture. This was revolutionary for a different reason. For centuries, painting had been about creating illusions. A painted grape that looked so real, a bird would try to eat it. But Pablo was saying, why pretend? If I want texture in my painting, I'll glue actual textured material to the canvas. If I want text, I'll paste newspaper. Reality doesn't need to be imitated, it can be directly incorporated. The implications were staggering. If a painting could include pieces of the real world, then the boundary between art and life became permeable. Art wasn't a window onto reality. It was a reality itself, operating by its own rules. He was becoming famous now. Not popular, but famous. The kind of famous where people write articles denouncing you, where your paintings cause scandals, where collectors who buy your work are considered either visionary or insane. The money remained inconsistent. He lived in poverty through most of the Cubist years, relying on a small circle of dealers and collectors who believed in what he was doing. Gertrude Stein bought his work and championed him in her salon. Daniel Henry Kahnweiler became his primary dealer, someone who understood that he was witnessing a revolution. But Pablo didn't care about money in any conventional sense. He cared about solving problems. Each painting was an experiment, a test of some new principle. Could you show front and side views simultaneously? Could you flatten space while maintaining depth? Could you make a painting that looked abstract from a distance, but revealed recognizable forms up close? His personal life was becoming as fragmented as his paintings. The relationship with Fernanda had deteriorated. She'd been his muse during the Rose period, but now he needed something different. He met a young woman named Eva Guel. He called her Ma Jolie, my pretty one, and the phrase began appearing in his cubist paintings, hidden among the geometric planes like a secret message. Eva understood what he was trying to do in a way Fernanda never had. She didn't just tolerate the work, she engaged with it, argued about it, pushed him. For 2 years they were inseparable. His paintings from this period have a lightness, almost a playfulness, that hadn't been there before. Then Europe went insane. August 1914, the war that everyone said would be over by Christmas, consumed an entire generation. Braque was called up immediately. Their partnership, that daily exchange of ideas, abruptly ended. Braque went to the front and nearly died from a head wound. He would survive, but he and Pablo would never work together in the same way again. Pablo was Spanish, technically a foreigner in France. He wasn't required to serve. He stayed in Paris while the city transformed around him. The cafes where artists had argued about the nature of reality became recruitment centres. The streets filled with wounded soldiers. The avant-garde scattered or died. And Eva got sick. Tuberculosis, the disease that had stalked his childhood in Barcelona. She declined rapidly. He painted her, tried to capture something of her presence in cubist fragments. But cubism, he was discovering, wasn't well suited for expressing certain kinds of emotion. How do you paint grief when your style is based on intellectual analysis rather than emotional expression? Eva died in December 1915. Pablo was 34 years old and had now watched two people he loved destroy themselves. Casajamas with a bullet, Eva with a disease. The blue returned to his work, not as a period but as an undertone, a shadow. Something was shifting. Cubism had been a joint project, a conversation between him and Braque. Now, Braque was gone, Eva was dead, and the world had revealed itself to be far more violent and chaotic than any painting could capture. What was the point of fragmenting reality when reality was fragmenting itself? He began moving in different circles. The Russian ballet impresario Sergei Diaghilev commissioned him to design sets and costumes for a production called Parade. This forced Pablo into a different mode entirely. Theatre required clarity, legibility, impact. You couldn't make cubist sets that the audience couldn't pass from their seats. He designed the sets, and while working on them, he met a dancer named Olga Koklova. She was from the Russian aristocracy, beautiful in a conventional way, utterly unlike the bohemian women he'd been involved with. She wanted stability, marriage, respectability, everything that Pablo had spent his adult life rejecting. He married her in 1918. The war ended the same year. The 1920s brought a strange duality to Pablo's work. He was still doing cubist paintings, still fragmenting form and space, but he also began producing completely different kinds of work simultaneously. Neoclassical drawings and paintings of solid monumental figures that looked like they could have been made 2,000 years ago in ancient Greece. Critics were confused. Was he abandoning cubism? Had he decided the whole experiment was a failure? But Pablo wasn't abandoning anything. He was demonstrating something the critics couldn't grasp, that there was no single correct way to represent reality. Cubism was one tool. Neoclassicism was another. He could use both in the same week, sometimes on the same day. It wasn't inconsistency, it was freedom. The freedom to paint any way the moment demanded, without being imprisoned by a single style or approach. If Cubism was about fragmenting reality, this new multiplicity was about fragmenting identity itself. Pablo Picasso wasn't a cubist or a neoclassicist. He was both and neither, a shapeshifter who could work in any mode. But there was a cost to this versatility. The marriage to Olga was deteriorating. She'd wanted a respectable bourgeois life, and instead found herself married to a man who worked constantly, who refused to behave like a proper husband, who was constitutionally incapable of fidelity. They had a son, Paulo, in 1921. Pablo loved the boy, but fatherhood didn't domesticate him. If anything, it intensified his need for escape. He began an affair with a 17-year-old named Marie-Thérèse Walter. He was 45. She was barely older than a child. The paintings changed again. Curves returned, sensuality, the rigid geometry of cubism softened into something more organic, more overtly sexual. Marie-Thérèse appeared in his work constantly. Her features transformed into flowing, biomorphic forms. He was making some of the most beautiful paintings of his career, while his personal life became increasingly chaotic. Olga knew about Marie-Thérèse but couldn't leave. Divorce would mean splitting assets, and Pablo had become wealthy enough that this mattered. So they lived in hostile coexistence while he maintained a second household with his teenage mistress. And then the world began sliding toward another war. The Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936. General Francisco Franco led a military coup against the elected Republican government, and within weeks the country was tearing itself apart. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany backed Franco's nationalists. The Soviet Union supported the Republicans, though less effectively. International brigades of volunteers flooded into Spain to fight fascism. Writers like George Orwell and Ernest Hemingway went to document and participate in what they saw as the defining conflict of the age. Pablo was in Paris when it started. He'd been living between France and Spain for decades, but now Spain was fragmenting into something unrecognizable. The Republic appointed him director of the Prado Museum, an honorific position meant to keep him symbolically aligned with the Republican cause. He accepted but never actually went to Madrid. The city was under siege. What could he do there? Instead, he did what he always did. He worked. In January 1937, he began a series of etchings called The Dream and Lie of Franco. They were savage, grotesque caricatures showing Franco as a diseased polyp, a monstrous blob consuming Spain. The prints were sold to raise money for Republican refugees. It was propaganda, but propaganda in Pablo's hands became something stranger and more visceral than mere political messaging. Then came April 26, 1937. The Basque town of Guernica, a place of no military significance, was bombed by German and Italian aircraft, supporting Franco's forces. It was a market day. The planes came in waves, dropping explosive and incendiary bombs, then strafing fleeing civilians with machine gun fire. The attack lasted over 2 hours. When it ended, the town was in ruins. Estimates of the dead ranged from 200 to 1,600. No one knew exactly. The bodies were too numerous and too destroyed to count accurately. News reached Paris within days. The Spanish Republican government had commissioned Pablo to create a mural for their pavilion at the upcoming Paris World's Fair. He'd been struggling with the commission, unsure what to paint. Now he knew. He rented a space on Rue de Grand Augustin, a 17th century building with a large room on the second floor. The canvas he ordered was enormous, over 11 feet tall and 25 feet wide. He began working immediately, furiously, filling sketchbook after sketchbook with preparatory drawings. The imagery came from somewhere deep and old. A bull, a horse, a fallen warrior, women screaming, a light bulb like an evil eye. These weren't symbols he invented for the occasion. They were forms he'd been working with for years, archetypal images that now found their perfect subject. The composition went through radical changes. Photographs taken by Dora Maar, his new lover, who had replaced Marie-Thérèse, document the evolution. A raised fist disappeared. A figure's position shifted. The bull's head rotated. Nothing was fixed until it was fixed, and even then Pablo kept adjusting. He worked for weeks, often through the night. Visitors who came to the studio described him as possessed, barely speaking, moving between the canvas and his sketches in a trance of concentrated fury. What emerged was unlike anything he'd painted before. It was cubist in its fragmentation, but there was nothing analytical or detached about it. This was cubism turned into a scream. The palette was almost entirely black, white and grey, like newsprint, like documentary photographs, like the ash and smoke of a burning town. The figures were contorted, their mouths open in agony, their eyes wide with terror. A woman held a dead child. A horse writhed with a spear through its side. A dismembered warrior lay on the ground, his broken sword near his severed hand. Above it all, the light bulb blazed like a blind, indifferent sun. Guernica was unveiled at the Paris World's Fair in July 1937. The Spanish pavilion was a modest building, but the painting dominated it completely. Reactions were mixed. Some critics found it incomprehensible, a mess of distorted forms that communicated nothing. Others recognized immediately what Pablo had done. He'd found a visual language for modern atrocity, This wasn't a traditional war painting showing heroic soldiers and noble sacrifice. This was civilians caught in mechanized slaughter, terror without redemption or meaning. The painting began to travel. It went to London, then to Scandinavia, then eventually to the United States, where it would remain for decades, touring constantly to raise awareness and funds. Pablo specified that it could not return to Spain until democracy was restored. Franco would rule until 1975. The painting would not go home until 1981. But Guernica accomplished something beyond its immediate political impact. It proved that Cubism, that analytical dissection of form that critics had dismissed as cold intellectual exercise, could carry emotional weight that traditional realism couldn't touch. The fragmentation wasn't decorative, it was the point. A bombing doesn't leave bodies intact. Terror doesn't experience the world in orderly perspective. By shattering the visual field, Pablo had found a way to represent not just what happened, but how it felt. The painting also marked a shift in Pablo's relationship to politics. Before Guernica, he'd been essentially apolitical, focused entirely on art and personal relationships. The Spanish Civil War made indifference impossible. He joined the French Communist Party in 1944, after the liberation of Paris. He remained a member for the rest of his life, though his relationship with party orthodoxy was complicated. The communists wanted socialist realism, clear, accessible art, showing workers in heroic poses. Pablo kept painting whatever he wanted. They tolerated him because his fame was useful. He tolerated them because the party represented, however imperfectly, opposition to fascism. The Second World War was different from the First. In 1914, Pablo had been a foreigner in Paris, able to sit out the conflict. In 1940, Paris fell to the Nazis, and he was suddenly living under occupation. He stayed in his studio on Rue des Grands Augustins. He could have fled to the United States, where museums would have welcomed him. He could have gone to South America. He had options. He stayed. The Germans knew exactly who he was. His work had been featured in the Nazis' degenerate art exhibition, the massive propaganda show that travelled Germany displaying modernist art as evidence of cultural decline. A Gestapo officer allegedly visited his studio, saw a photograph of Guernica and asked, "Did you do that?" Pablo replied, "No, you did." The story may be apocryphal, it sounds too perfect, but it captures something true about his position during those years. He wasn't openly resisting, wasn't joining the resistance, but he wasn't collaborating either. He simply continued working, painting in his studio while the city starved and died around him. The work from this period is dark. Skulls, bones, twisted figures, a series of paintings showing a cat devouring a bird. The subject matter reflected the times, but the style remained recognizably his. Liberation came in August 1944. The photographer Robert Capa took a famous image of Pablo standing outside his studio, surrounded by celebrating crowds. He looks older now, heavier, his hair completely grey. He was 63. He'd lived through 2 world wars, the Spanish Civil War, occupation, and emerged somehow intact, still working, still producing. The post-war years brought a new kind of fame. Pablo had always been well known in art circles, but now he became a global celebrity. His face appeared on magazine covers. Newsreels showed him at bullfights, at parties surrounded by admirers. He was the archetypal modern artist. Brilliant, difficult, magnetic, impossible to ignore. Museums competed to show his work. Collectors paid astronomical prices for his paintings. He moved to the south of France, settling eventually in a villa near Cannes. The light there was different from Paris, brighter, harsher, Mediterranean. He began working in ceramics, producing thousands of plates, vases, and tiles decorated with bulls, faces, and figures. It was a medium he'd never seriously explored before, and he attacked it with characteristic energy, treating the pottery studio like another canvas. His personal life remained chaotic. Olga died in 1955, finally releasing him from the marriage that had been dead for decades. Marie-Thérèse was still in the picture, though she'd long since ceased being his primary partner. Dora Maar had been replaced by Françoise Gillot, a painter 40 years younger than him. They had 2 children together, Claude and Paloma. Françoise would eventually leave him in 1953, one of the few women who managed to extract herself from his orbits. Then came Jacqueline Roquet, who would be his final companion. She was 27 when they met in 1953. He was 72. They married in 1961 after Olga's death made it legally possible. Jacqueline would appear in more of his paintings than any other woman. Hundreds of portraits showing her in various guises, as a Spanish queen, as an odalisque, as herself. But the work from these final decades shows something else happening. Pablo was in conversation now, not just with reality, but with the entire history of art. He began making variations on masterpieces by other painters: Delacroix's Women of Algiers, Velázquez's Las Meninas, Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. These weren't copies or homages. They were arguments, interventions, Pablo inserting himself into canonical works and transforming them through his vision. The Las Meninas series is particularly revealing. Velázquez's original painting is a meditation on seeing and being seen, on the relationship between painter, subject, and viewer. Pablo made 58 variations on it between August and December 1957, isolating individual figures, rearranging the composition, reducing the complex spatial relationships to stark geometric forms. He was simultaneously honouring the original and colonising it, making it his. Critics didn't know what to make of these late works. Some saw them as the productions of an old man running out of ideas, recycling the past because he couldn't create anything new. Others recognised them as something stranger. Pablo asserting his right to the entire Western tradition, treating centuries of art history as raw material he could manipulate however he chose. The speed at which he worked remained astonishing. He'd wake early, work all morning, break for lunch, work through the afternoon and evening. He produced paintings, drawings, prints, sculptures, ceramics at a rate that would have exhausted artists half his age. The final count of his lifetime output is staggering. Over 13,000 paintings, 100,000 prints and engravings, 34,000 book illustrations, 300 sculptures and ceramics. No artist in history had ever been so prolific, but quantity alone doesn't explain why his late work matters. What's remarkable is that he never stopped experimenting. An artist in his 80s, wealthy beyond measure, famous beyond comprehension, could have coasted on his reputation. Instead, Pablo kept pushing, kept trying new things, kept refusing to settle into a comfortable late style. Some of the paintings from his final years are deliberately crude, almost childlike. Others are technically brilliant. He moved between modes without explanation or apology. The art world by the 1960s had moved far beyond Cubism. Abstract expressionism had dominated the 1950s. Pop art was ascendant. Minimalism was emerging. The avant-garde had new heroes: Jackson Pollock, Andy Warhol, Donald Judd. Pablo belonged to an earlier era, a different set of concerns. He was history now, not current events. He didn't care. He kept working. His eyesight was failing, his hands less steady, but the energy never dimmed. He painted until the end, producing work that museums would acquire, but critics would largely ignore until decades after his death, when scholars began to recognise that the late paintings weren't decline, but yet another transformation. On April 8, 1973, Pablo Picasso died at his villa in Mougins, France. He was 91 years old. He'd been working that morning. The funeral took place 3 days later in the grounds of the Château de Vauvenargues, the medieval fortress Pablo had bought in 1958 and barely lived in. The French government wanted a state funeral. Jacqueline refused. She wanted him buried quickly, quietly, with minimal ceremony. Only a handful of people attended: Jacqueline, Pablo's son Paulo, a few close friends. The coffin was lowered into a grave in the garden. Above it, Jacqueline placed one of Pablo's sculptures, a bronze woman holding a vase. The art world's response was immediate and contradictory. Obituaries celebrated him as the greatest artist of the 20th century, while simultaneously expressing relief that his dominance was finally over. Younger artists could emerge from his shadow. The market could move on. History could be written. But writing that history proved difficult. What do you do with an artist who changed direction every few years, who worked in styles that contradicted each other, who refused to be consistent? The neat narratives that art historians prefer didn't fit. You couldn't reduce Pablo to a single idea or movement. He'd been too many things. The estate was chaos. Pablo had never made a will. French inheritance law meant everything would be divided among his heirs. But first it had to be catalogued and valued. The process took 6 years and required a team of experts to locate, authenticate, and appraise thousands of works scattered across multiple properties. The final inventory filled 47 volumes. The French government accepted art in lieu of estate taxes, creating what became the Musée Picasso in Paris, which opened in 1985. Meanwhile, the market went wild. Prices for Pablo's work had been high during his lifetime, but they exploded after his death. Museums competed to acquire major pieces. Private collectors drove up auction prices. By the 1990s, his paintings were selling for tens of millions of dollars. By the 2010s, several had crossed 200 million. The art market had decided that Pablo Picasso was not just important, but also the safest possible investment, blue-chip art that would only appreciate. This financial success created its own problems. When art becomes that valuable, it attracts criminals. Pablo's work has been stolen more than any other artist's, taken from museums, galleries, and private collections worldwide. Some pieces have been recovered. Others remain missing, presumably hidden in private collections or destroyed. The legal battles were equally messy. People emerged claiming to be Pablo's illegitimate children. Former lovers sued for recognition. Dealers fought over authenticity. The Picasso administration, the official body managing his estate, spent decades in court defending against fraudulent claims and fake attributions. The sheer volume of Pablo's output meant that forgeries were inevitable. He'd produced so much in so many different styles that almost anything could plausibly be a Picasso. But beyond the money and the lawsuits, a different question persisted. What did Pablo Picasso actually mean? What was his contribution beyond being prolific and famous? The feminist critique began almost immediately after his death. Writers and scholars started examining his treatment of women not as personal gossip, but as central to understanding his work. Could you separate the art from the biography? Should you? The women he'd painted were often beautiful, but they were also frequently distorted, dismembered, transformed into objects. Was this formal experimentation or misogyny made visible? The argument continues. Some scholars insist the work must be understood on its own terms, as visual problem-solving independent of the artist's character. Others argue that Pablo's relationships with women weren't incidental to his art, but fundamental to it, that the violence in the paintings reflected actual violence in his life, that celebrating the work meant ignoring the harm. There's no resolution to this debate because it touches on larger questions about what art is for and whether artists' lives matter to how we interpret their work. Pablo's case is extreme because he was so successful, so prolific, and so deliberately mythologized, but the underlying tension exists for many artists. Setting aside the biographical controversies, what remains is the work itself. and the work, spread across museums worldwide, tells a story about what became possible in 20th century art. Before Pablo, painting was primarily about representing the visible world with varying degrees of accuracy and style. You could be realistic like Caravaggio or loose like Monet, but the basic assumption held: painting depicted things. Pablo, along with Braque and others, broke that assumption. After Cubism, painting could be about pure form, about the act of seeing itself, about intellectual concepts rather than visual appearances. This sounds abstract, but it had practical consequences. Every abstract painter who followed, from Kandinsky to Rothko to contemporary artists making work with no representational content whatsoever, benefited from the door Pablo helped open. You don't have to like his work or approve of his life to recognize that he changed what painting could be. The influence extended beyond painting. Sculpture, printmaking, ceramics, even fashion and design felt his impact. The angular, fragmented aesthetic of Cubism became part of the visual language of modernity itself. Art Deco architecture borrowed from it. Early computer graphics echoed it. The idea that you could show multiple perspectives simultaneously became so embedded in visual culture that most people don't even notice it anymore. But Pablo's legacy is complicated by a paradox. He was revolutionary, but he was also profoundly traditional. He spent his entire life in dialogue with the old masters, constantly referencing Velázquez, Delacroix, Ingres, Poussin. His innovations weren't rejections of art history, but aggressive reinterpretations of it. He wanted to be part of the canon while simultaneously destroying and remaking it. This makes him different from artists who came after and truly rejected the past. The abstract expressionists wanted to create something entirely new, uniquely American, unconnected to European tradition. Pablo never wanted that. He was Spanish and French, deeply European, obsessed with museums and masterpieces. His radicalism was conservative in its way, rooted in profound engagement with what came before. The museum exhibitions continued long after his death. Major retrospectives travelled the world, each one trying to make sense of his career. The 1980 Museum of Modern Art show focused on his relationship with primitivism. The 1996 National Gallery exhibition examined his portraits. The 2009 Tate Modern retrospective explored his late work, finally giving those paintings serious attention. Each exhibition told a different story because Pablo's work could support multiple narratives. He was capacious enough, contradictory enough that curators could emphasize different aspects and create completely different shows. There was Cubist Pablo, Surrealist Pablo, Classical Pablo, Late Experimental Pablo. They were all real, all supported by substantial bodies of work. The 21st century brought new technologies and new questions. Digital archives made it possible to see his entire output in ways that weren't feasible before. Scholars could track stylistic evolution with precision, identify exact moments when new approaches emerged, compare works from different periods side by side. This revealed patterns that weren't visible when you could only see scattered examples in different museums. The research complicated the simple story of genius. It showed how much Pablo borrowed, how many ideas came from collaborators, how often he returned to the same motifs and reworked them. The myth of the solitary creator giving birth to revolutionary forms gave way to a more accurate picture of an artist in constant conversation with others, building on existing ideas, sometimes taking credit for collaborative inventions. This didn't diminish his achievement, but it made it more human. Pablo became less a demigod and more an extraordinarily talented, ambitious, and driven person who worked harder than almost anyone else and had the technical skill to execute his ideas brilliantly. The market, meanwhile, kept climbing. In 2015, his painting Women of Algiers sold for over $179 million. setting a new auction record. In 2018, a different work went for $115 million. The prices meant that most of his major paintings were now locked away in private collections or museums, rarely seen by the general public. Owning a Picasso became a status symbol for billionaires, a way to display wealth and cultural sophistication simultaneously. This created an odd situation where Pablo was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. His name recognition was universal. Anyone could identify his style. But most people had never actually stood in front of one of his paintings. They knew him through reproductions, posters, coffee mugs, the degraded images that circulate in popular culture. The real work remained inaccessible. Perhaps that was appropriate. Pablo had always been concerned with reproduction and multiplication. He made prints because they could be distributed widely. He welcomed photography of his work. He understood that modern art existed partly through its copies, its echoes, its presence in culture beyond museums. The fact that millions of people had Picasso posters on their walls but had never seen the originals might have pleased him. He wanted to be everywhere. His influence on other artists remained profound but shifted over time. The generation immediately after him either imitated or rejected his example. But by the late 20th century, artists could engage with his work more freely, without the anxiety of competing with a living legend. They could borrow elements, reference specific paintings, argue with his ideas through their own work. Contemporary artists like David Hockney, Gerhard Richter, and Jeff Koons all acknowledged Pablo's impact, while taking completely different directions. His example wasn't about style anymore, but about permission, the license to experiment, to change, to be multiple things, to refuse to settle into a comfortable late career. The scholarly literature kept expanding. Books examined every period, every medium, every relationship, every influence. The bibliography of works about Pablo runs to thousands of entries. No artist has been more thoroughly studied, more completely documented, more exhaustively analysed, yet something remained elusive. The work itself resisted final interpretation. You could explain Cubism's formal innovations, trace the biographical sources of specific paintings, identify the art historical references, and still not capture what made the work powerful. There was something in the best pieces that exceeded explanation, that operated on a level beyond intellectual analysis. Standing in front of Guernica or Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, or even some of the late strange portraits, viewers still felt something that couldn't be reduced to context or technique. The paintings had presence, a kind of visual energy that came from the intensity with which they'd been made. Pablo had poured himself into the work with such force that the force remained visible decades later. This is what ultimately matters, not the market prices or the biographical scandals or the critical debates, but the fact that the paintings still worked, still demanded attention, still refused to be ignored. They weren't polite or easy or comfortable. They pushed back against the viewer, insisted on their own terms, created their own space. The 21st century also brought new critical frameworks. Post-colonial scholars examined Pablo's appropriation of African and oceanic art, questioning whether his discovery of primitivism was actually cultural theft. This opened uncomfortable discussions about modernism's relationship to colonialism, about whether European artists had the right to borrow from cultures they'd helped oppress. These questions didn't have simple answers. Pablo had genuinely admired the African masks and Iberian sculptures he'd collected. But admiration doesn't equal understanding, and borrowing forms without engaging with their original contexts and meanings was problematic. The fact that he'd become rich and famous partly through these appropriations, while the cultures he'd borrowed from remained marginalized, added another layer of complexity. Feminist critics similarly challenged his treatment of women, both in his personal life and in his art. The pattern was undeniable, Pablo had used women as muses, models, lovers, and then often discarded them when they no longer served his creative needs. The portraits he made of them frequently depicted them as fragmented, distorted, sometimes monstrous. Was this how he actually saw them, or was it simply how he painted everyone? The question mattered because his work had shaped how generations of artists and viewers thought about depicting the female body. Some argued that his treatment was universal, that he subjected male subjects to similar distortions. Others pointed out that the power dynamics were different, that a man fragmenting women's bodies carried implications that fragmenting his own self-portraits didn't. The debate continued, complicated by the fact that many of the women themselves had spoken admiringly of Pablo during his lifetime. They'd felt seen by him, important to him, even as he'd also used them. The relationship between artist and muse has always been complex. Pablo didn't invent it, but he practiced it with such intensity and repetition that his example became the model, often in ways that weren't healthy. Younger artists, especially women artists, increasingly rejected that model, insisting on their own agency, refusing to be anyone's raw material. This was progress. It also meant reconsidering Pablo's legacy in a more critical light. None of this erased what he'd accomplished formally. The innovations remained innovations. Cubism had genuinely changed how art could represent space and form. The collages had opened new possibilities for what materials and methods could be considered art. The constant experimentation had proven that an artist didn't need to settle into a signature style to be great. These contributions stood regardless of biographical complications, but they stood differently now. Context mattered. Understanding the circumstances under which art was made, the power structures it emerged from, the voices it silenced or exploited, all of this had become part of how we looked at historical work. Pablo's art didn't exist in a vacuum. It was made by a specific person in specific circumstances, and those circumstances included privilege, exploitation, and appropriation, alongside genius and innovation. Museums began addressing these issues more directly. Wall texts accompanying major exhibitions started including information about his problematic relationships and his appropriations. Some institutions held symposia examining these questions. The goal wasn't to cancel Pablo or remove his work from display, but to present it more completely, to acknowledge the full story rather than just the triumphant narrative of artistic genius. This shift reflected broader changes in how cultural institutions thought about their role. The old model of simply presenting great art for contemplation had given way to something more complex. Museums now saw themselves as spaces for dialogue, places where difficult questions could be raised and multiple perspectives could coexist. Pablo's work became a test case for this new approach. The market, meanwhile, continued its own logic. Prices kept climbing. In 2015, Women of Algiers sold for over $179 million, setting a new auction record at the time. The buyer was anonymous. The painting disappeared into a private collection. This was the other reality of Pablo's legacy. While scholars debated his appropriations and critics questioned his treatment of women, his paintings were becoming investment vehicles for the ultra-wealthy. There's something troubling about this disconnect. The work that mattered culturally, that continued to influence artists and provoke discussions, was often locked away in storage or hidden in private homes. The pieces visible to the public were mainly in museums that had acquired them decades earlier. New collectors weren't buying Pablo's work to display it publicly or to contribute to cultural conversations. They were buying it to own something valuable, to possess a piece of art history. This raised questions about what art was for. Pablo had made his work public whenever possible. He'd wanted exhibitions, wanted people to see what he was doing, wanted to be part of the ongoing conversation about what art could be. The fact that so much of his output was now treated purely as financial assets would probably have disgusted him, though he'd certainly enjoyed making money when he was alive. The digital age brought new ways of experiencing his work. High-resolution images online meant anyone could examine Les Demoiselles d'Avignon or Guernica in detail from anywhere in the world. Virtual reality exhibitions let people walk through recreated versions of his studios. These technologies democratized access in ways that would have been impossible during his lifetime. You didn't need to travel to New York or Madrid or Paris to see his major works anymore. You could pull them up on a screen, zoom in on brushstrokes, compare different periods side by side. This changed the nature of engagement. Looking at a painting on a phone isn't the same as standing in front of it, experiencing its physical presence, its scale, its texture. Something got lost in translation, but something also got gained. People who would never visit a museum could now study his work closely. Students in countries without major collections could access the images they needed for their research. The trade-off was complicated. Pablo's face itself became iconic, those intense eyes staring out from photographs by David Douglas Duncan or Guyon Milly, the striped sailor shirts he often wore in later years, the shock of white hair, the image of the artist as this vital, energetic figure working into old age became almost as famous as the art itself. He'd become a brand, a symbol of artistic genius and creative freedom. This celebrity sometimes obscured the work. People knew the name without knowing the paintings. They recognized his face without understanding what made him important. He existed in popular culture as a kind of shorthand for modern art, often used without much thought about what that actually meant. References to Pablo in movies, television, advertisements usually just signaled art or creativity without engaging with his actual ideas or methods. The educational system struggled with how to teach him. He was too important to ignore. Every art history survey covered Cubism, usually focusing on Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and a few analytic Cubist works, but fitting 80 years of productivity and constant change into a few lectures was impossible. Students got a simplified version, the greatest hits, without much sense of the full complexity or the problematic elements. Some teachers tried harder. They'd show the range of work, discuss the controversies, encourage students to form their own opinions rather than just absorbing the established narrative. This took more time and effort than most curricula allowed. The result was that most people who'd studied Pablo in school had a partial, sometimes misleading understanding of who he was and what he'd done. His influence on popular culture extended beyond fine art. Graphic designers borrowed Cubist fragmentation. Fashion designers referenced his color palettes and bold shapes. Musicians talked about taking inspiration from his willingness to constantly reinvent himself. He'd become a reference point across multiple fields, often by people who'd never looked at his paintings carefully. This kind of cultural osmosis both spread his influence and diluted it. Ideas that originated in his work circulated without attribution, without context, without connection to their source. He'd become part of the background noise of visual culture, present everywhere and nowhere at once. The late work, which had been dismissed or ignored for decades, started receiving more attention in the early 21st century. Major exhibitions focused specifically on his final years. Critics began reconsidering paintings they'd previously dismissed as crude or desperate. What if those late works weren't failures, but radical experiments? What if the looseness and apparent carelessness were actually sophisticated responses to a lifetime of technical mastery? This revision was partly generational. New critics without personal memories of Pablo as a living figure could look at the work more neutrally. They weren't comparing it to what he'd done before, or judging it against expectations. They could see it on its own terms, as a body of work made by an old artist confronting mortality and trying to compress a lifetime of seeing into increasingly simplified forms. Some of those late paintings now looked prophetic. The raw, almost violent brushwork anticipated developments. in painting that came decades later. The way he flattened form while maintaining emotional intensity seemed to predict where figurative painting would go after abstraction had run its course. He'd been ahead of his time even in old age, though it took years for anyone to realize it. The Musée Picasso in Paris, housed in a 17th century mansion in the Marais, held the largest collection of his work. The French government had accepted thousands of pieces in lieu of estate taxes after his death. This created a permanent public resource, a place where the full range of his production could be studied. The museum reopened in 2014 after a 5-year renovation, expanded and modernized, capable of displaying the collection more completely than before. Walking through those galleries provided an experience impossible to get from books or online images. You could see the progression of ideas from room to room, understand how one period led to another, trace the development of specific motifs across decades. The accumulation of work in one place made visible patterns that individual masterpieces couldn't show. Other museums held significant collections. The Museum of Modern Art in New York had Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and many Cubist works. The Reina Sofia in Madrid had Guernica and related studies. The Hermitage in St. Petersburg, the National Gallery in London, the Art Institute of Chicago all held important pieces, but no single institution could show everything. His output was too vast, too scattered across collections worldwide. This dispersal reflected how he'd worked. He'd sold to dealers in different countries, given works to friends and lovers, donated pieces to museums. The geographical spread meant his influence had developed differently in different places. American museums emphasized the Cubist breakthrough and the Rose period. European institutions often held more of the later work. Russian collections included pieces from his time in Paris before the Revolution. Each collection told a slightly different story. Taken together, they documented a career of almost unimaginable productivity and range, but they also made it difficult to grasp the whole. You could spend years traveling to museums and still not see everything important. Much remained in private hands, invisible to scholars and the public. The archives presented similar challenges. His correspondence, sketchbooks, preliminary studies, working notes, all of this material existed but remained scattered. Some was in museum archives, some in private collections, some still with his descendants. Scholars had access to portions of this material, but not all of it. New discoveries kept emerging, letters found in unexpected places, drawings that had been forgotten in storage. Each new piece of evidence changed understanding slightly. A sketch revealed that a painting everyone thought was spontaneous had actually been carefully planned. A letter showed that a relationship everyone assumed was casual had been intensely emotional. These incremental adjustments continued reshaping the narrative, keeping Pablo's scholarship active and contentious. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren became stewards of the legacy. Some pursued their own creative careers, working in his shadow but trying to establish independent identities. Others focused on managing the estate, overseeing exhibitions, authenticating works, protecting the brand. The family dynamics were complex, involving disputes over control and money, competing visions of how to honor his memory. Marina Picasso, one of his granddaughters, had written critically about growing up in his shadow. She'd sold much of her inherited work, choosing financial independence over stewardship. Her memoir described the difficulty of being Pablo's descendant, of carrying a name that weighed so heavily it was hard to build your own identity. Other family members disagreed with her characterization, but her perspective revealed costs of the legacy that the triumphant public narrative often ignored. The authentication business became increasingly complicated. Fakes proliferated. He'd been so prolific and worked in so many styles that forgers had endless opportunities. The Picasso administration in Paris, established by his heirs, reviewed thousands of works annually, determining which were genuine and which weren't. The financial stakes made every decision consequential. A painting authenticated as real could be worth millions. One declared fake became worthless. This created ethical dilemmas. What if a work was probably real but couldn't be definitively proven? What if it was probably fake but couldn't be ruled out entirely? The committee had to make judgment calls based on incomplete information, knowing their decisions would affect not just financial value, but art historical understanding. They had to balance being rigorous with being fair. The museum exhibitions became spectacles. A major Picasso show could draw hundreds of thousands of visitors, lines stretching around blocks, timed tickets selling out months in advance. Museums competed to mount these blockbusters, knowing they'd boost membership and revenue. But the popularity created problems. How do you display work to crowds that size? How do you let people actually see the paintings when they're jostling for position? Some institutions limited viewing time, moving people through galleries quickly. Others required reservations for specific slots. The experience became less about contemplation and more about confirming you'd been there, taking your photo next to the famous works, checking them off a cultural bucket list. This wasn't what he would have wanted. His work demanded time and attention. The paintings rewarded close looking, revealing details and relationships that disappeared in a quick pass. But the institutional pressures and public appetite created conditions where depth was impossible. You got your 10 seconds in front of Guernica and moved on. The scholarship kept evolving. Every decade brought new interpretative frameworks. Feminist critics examined his treatment of women, finding patterns of appropriation and dominance that earlier scholars had overlooked or excused. Post-colonial theorists analysed his use of African forms, questioning whether his cubist breakthrough constituted genuine engagement or merely extraction. Psychoanalytic approaches explored his obsessions and traumas, reading the work as coded autobiography. Each methodology revealed something, but none captured everything. The paintings resisted final interpretation. They were rich enough, complex enough, to support multiple readings. This was part of their power. They didn't deliver simple messages. They created spaces where meaning emerged through looking, through thinking, through feeling. Different viewers found different things, and all of them could be right. The market reached absurd levels. In 2015, Women of Algiers sold for over $179 million, setting a record for any artwork sold at auction. The buyer remained anonymous. The painting disappeared into private hands, removed from public view. This happened repeatedly. The most expensive works ended up in storage, investments held by collectors who might never hang them, who might never even see them except in photographs. The art became purely financial instrument, wealth stored in paint and canvas. Critics decried this. Museums protested, but nothing stopped it. The works were too valuable, too desirable, too useful as assets. Collectors justified the purchases by promising eventual donations to institutions, but those donations might not happen for decades, might include conditions that limited access, might go to private museums that served more as monuments to their founders than as public resources. Meanwhile, the painting sat in climate-controlled storage, seen by no one. His political legacy remained contested. The left claimed him, pointing to Guernica and his Communist Party membership. The right dismissed the politics as performance, arguing the work transcended ideology. Both sides were partly right and partly wrong. He had been political, genuinely committed to certain causes, but he'd also been pragmatic, self-interested, willing to compromise when necessary. The party had valued him as propaganda, as proof that intellectuals supported the revolution. He'd valued the party as protection, as community, as structure. The relationship was transactional on both sides. Guernica became universal shorthand for protest against war. It appeared on posters, in documentaries, in political speeches. Everyone knew the image even if they'd never seen the actual painting. But this familiarity bred superficial understanding. People recognized the screaming horse and the broken sword without engaging with the specific context. It became generalized anti-war sentiment rather than focused response to particular atrocity. The power remained, but the precision faded. When you make something too iconic, you risk making it invisible through overexposure. The late work slowly gained appreciation. For decades, critics had dismissed the paintings from his final years as inferior, the products of declining powers. But by the early 21st century, a reassessment was underway. Scholars argued these works deserved reconsideration, that their apparent crudeness was actually radical freedom, that loose handling and violent distortions represented a final breaking of rules. Exhibitions focused specifically on the late paintings, inviting fresh evaluation. Some viewers remained unconvinced. Others found in these works a rawness and urgency that made the earlier perfection seem calculated. The debate continued. His influence on contemporary art remained enormous but often unacknowledged. Younger artists worked in his shadow, whether they knew it or not. The permission he'd granted to fragment, to distort, to borrow, to synthesize, all of this had become so fundamental to how art worked that its origin was forgotten. He'd changed the rules so completely that the new rules felt natural, inevitable, as if art had always operated this way. But it hadn't. Before him, representation followed different logic. After him, anything became possible. The studio photographs from his final years showed him still working, still engaged, surrounded by paintings in various stages of completion. His face in these images was ancient, deeply lined, but his eyes remained sharp. He stared at the camera with the same intensity he'd brought to his subjects decades earlier. He knew what he'd accomplished, he knew what he represented, but he also seemed to understand that the work would outlive its maker, that it would continue generating meaning and controversy long after he was gone. In some of the late interviews, he talked about death matter-of-factly. He wasn't afraid. He'd had a long life, done what he wanted to do, but he also expressed frustration that he wouldn't see how the story ended, wouldn't know what future generations made of his work. Artists rarely get to know their ultimate reception. They work in the present, hoping the future will care. He'd had unusual success during his lifetime, but he understood that reputations shift, that what seems important in one era can become irrelevant in the next. He couldn't control that. Nobody can. The year before his death, he gave an interview where he said something revealing. The journalist asked if he considered himself a genius. He paused, thought about it, then said he didn't know what genius meant. He'd worked hard, he'd taken risks, he'd followed his curiosity wherever it led. If that was genius, fine, but he didn't think of it that way. He thought of it as doing what he had to do, making what he needed to make. The label didn't matter. The work mattered. This humility surprised people who expected arrogance. But it was genuine. He knew he'd been good. He didn't need to boast. The paintings spoke for themselves. On April 8, 1973, he woke in his villa in Mougins, France. He was 91 years old. He'd been weakening for months, moving less, working less. But his mind remained sharp. He knew the end was approaching. That morning he sat with Jacqueline. They talked quietly. He seemed peaceful. Then suddenly, he couldn't breathe. His heart stopped. Within minutes, he was gone. The death was front-page news worldwide. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Radio stations played special segments. The obituaries filled newspapers, recounting the life, analysing the achievement, debating the legacy. World leaders issued statements. Museums announced memorial exhibitions. The art world went into mourning. But there was also a sense of completion. He'd lived fully, worked constantly, achieved more than seemed possible for one person. His death felt like the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in cultural history. The 20th century had been his century in many ways. He'd helped define it, shape it, give it visual form. Now it was moving toward its final decades without him. The funeral was private, held at the castle he'd owned in Vauvenargues. Only family and close friends attended. Jacqueline had him buried in the garden there, away from public scrutiny. She wanted to protect him even in death, to give him the privacy he'd never had in life. The grave was simple, marked by a sculpture he'd made decades earlier. No grand monument, no elaborate ceremony, just earth and stone and the Provençal sun. In the weeks after his death, stories emerged. People who'd known him shared memories. Dealers revealed negotiations. Models described sessions. The anecdotes painted a complex picture. He'd been generous and cruel, brilliant and petty, visionary and myopic. He'd helped people and hurt them. He'd created beauty and caused pain. He'd been, in other words, human, flawed and magnificent in equal measure. The estate became a battleground. His heirs fought over control, over money, over rights. Jacqueline, as his widow, held significant power, but other family members challenged her authority. Lawsuits followed, settlements were reached. The legal wrangling continued for years, exposing the less romantic side of artistic legacy. When great creators die, they leave behind not just work but wealth, and wealth attracts conflict. The retrospectives began immediately. Museums mounted major exhibitions, trying to capture the scope of the achievement. These shows were massive undertakings, borrowing from collections worldwide, bringing together works that had never been seen, side by side. Visitors lined up for hours, eager to pay tribute, to see the legend's work assembled in one place. The exhibitions confirmed what everyone already knew. He'd been extraordinary, but they also revealed something else. How varied the work was, how it resisted simple summary. You couldn't reduce him to a style or a period or a masterpiece. The achievement was the totality, the sheer, relentless productivity across decades. Scholars published new studies, some critical, some celebratory. The feminist critique grew sharper. Writers documented his treatment of women with increasing severity, arguing that the personal behaviour couldn't be separated from the professional achievement, that the art itself was marked by the same domination and appropriation that characterised his relationships. Others pushed back, arguing that judging past figures by present standards was ahistorical, that his flaws were products of his time and culture, that the work transcended its maker's failures. The debate became emblematic of larger arguments about how to evaluate complicated legacies. His children and grandchildren gave interviews, sharing perspectives that complicated the public image. Some described him as distant, more committed to work than family. Others remembered warmth and playfulness. The contradictions weren't surprising. People contain multitudes. He'd been different things to different people, generous to some, neglectful to others. The family memories humanized him, showing the private person behind the public legend. But they also revealed costs that the triumphant narrative often ignored. Success of his magnitude requires sacrifice, and not all of those sacrifices are made by the successful person. The markets kept rising. Each auction set new records. The works became increasingly unattainable, priced beyond what any institution could afford. Private collectors dominated, competing for trophy pieces that would never be publicly seen. This created a strange situation where the most important works by the most famous artist of the century were effectively removed from circulation, locked away in storage or private homes. Museums complained, critics protested, but nothing changed. The economics were irresistible. By the early 21st century, his name had become shorthand for artistic genius itself. When people wanted to praise someone's creative ability, they compared them to Picasso. When they wanted to describe revolutionary innovation, they invoked his example. The name carried weight that transcended art history, entering common language as synonym for brilliance. But this ubiquity created distance. The more famous he became, the harder it was to see the actual work clearly. The legend obscured the paintings. People thought they knew who he was without ever really looking at what he'd made. The challenge for anyone seriously engaging with his achievement was to push past the mythology, to ignore the money and the fame and the scandal, to stand in front of the paintings and actually see them. When you did that, when you looked with fresh eyes, the work remained astonishing. The invention never stopped surprising. The intelligence never stopped revealing itself. The paintings demanded attention and rewarded it. They were puzzles that couldn't be solved, but could be endlessly explored. Each viewing revealed something new, some relationship you hadn't noticed, some detail you'd missed. This was the mark of truly great work. It didn't exhaust itself. It kept giving. Decades after his death, scholars were still discovering connections, still finding influences, still debating meanings. The work remained alive, generative, productive of thought and feeling. This was his real achievement. Not the fame or the money or the records. The art itself, still speaking, still challenging, still mattering. Museums began organizing major retrospectives in the 1980s and 1990s. These shows drew unprecedented crowds, people lining up for hours to see paintings they'd only known from reproductions. The experience of encountering the actual work was consistently described as revelatory. The scale surprised visitors. Many pieces were larger than expected, commanding physical space in ways that photographs couldn't convey. The brushwork became visible, showing the hand that made the marks. Colours proved richer, relationships more complex. Standing before the originals, viewers understood why this work had mattered so profoundly. The Museum of Modern Art's 1980 retrospective attracted over 1 million visitors. It became a cultural phenomenon, covered not just in art magazines, but mainstream news. Lines wrapped around the block. The show demonstrated that serious art could still pull massive audiences. That difficulty and popularity weren't incompatible. People wanted to be challenged. They wanted to see what genius actually looked like. But the crowds created their own problem. You couldn't really look at a painting with hundreds of people pressing around you. The viewing experience became rushed, fragmentary. People moved through the galleries like they were checking items off a list, taking photos instead of looking. The institution of the blockbuster exhibition, while democratizing access, sometimes undermined the contemplation that art required. Smaller museums staged focused shows examining specific periods or themes. These exhibitions offered deeper engagement, allowing viewers to understand development and context. A show about the Blue Period revealed the evolution of his melancholy. An exhibition of the portraits showed how he transformed faces into geometric puzzles. A display of the late work demonstrated the continued invention of his final years. Each focused presentation illuminated aspects that the massive retrospectives couldn't. His relationship with photography became a subject of scholarly interest. He claimed to hate cameras, insisting that painting alone could capture truth. Yet he'd been photographed constantly throughout his career, and those photographs had shaped his public image as much as his paintings. The contradiction was revealing. He understood the power of mechanical reproduction even as he positioned painting against it. The photographs documented his process, showing him at work in the studio, surrounded by chaos, cigarette in hand, creating with apparent ease. Film became another medium for understanding his work. Documentary filmmakers gained access to his studios, capturing him in motion. The footage was extraordinary. You could watch him paint, see the speed and confidence of his marks, observe how he made decisions. The films revealed that the apparent chaos of his compositions emerged from rapid, assured choices. There was nothing tentative about his approach. He knew what he wanted and executed it without hesitation. One famous film showed him painting on glass, the camera positioned on the other side so viewers could watch the image emerge. It was like seeing thought made visible, Lines appeared, forms took shape, the painting built itself before your eyes. The speed was startling. What looked in the finished work like careful construction had been made with breathtaking quickness. The film demonstrated something crucial about his method. He didn't plan extensively. He discovered through doing. Art schools continued teaching his techniques, but the results often felt like empty exercises. Students could learn to break forms into geometric shapes, to flatten perspective, to fragment and reassemble, but they couldn't replicate the intelligence behind those moves. The difference between competent imitation and genuine innovation became painfully clear. Thousands could do what he'd done. None could do what he'd done first. The market kept climbing. By the 2000s, paintings that had sold for thousands in the 1950s were selling for hundreds of millions. The 2015 sale of Women of Algiers for over $179 million set a new record. 2 years later, Salvator Mundi, a painting whose attribution to Leonardo da Vinci remains disputed, sold for $450 million, but his work remained the consistent standard for astronomical prices. The numbers lost meaning, becoming abstractions that bore no relationship to art or value. Feminist scholars continued examining his treatment of women. The evidence was damning. His relationships had been exploitative, using women as muses and models, while discarding them when they no longer served his needs. His paintings often depicted women as fragmented, distorted, sometimes violently transformed. You could see the misogyny in the work itself, particularly in some of the more brutal portraits. The question was whether this invalidated the achievement. Some argued yes, that art made through exploitation carried that taint permanently. Others insisted on separating the work from the maker, judging paintings on their formal qualities, regardless of the artist's behaviour. The debate resisted resolution because both positions held truth. The work was remarkable. The behaviour was reprehensible. Holding both facts simultaneously required uncomfortable complexity. His children's memoirs added more details. Some painted him as a neglectful father, more interested in his work than his family. Others described moments of warmth and attention. The portrait that emerged was of a man who gave everything to his art, leaving little for those closest to him. This wasn't unusual among artists of his generation. The romantic notion of genius demanded total commitment, sacrificing personal life for creative achievement. But the costs of that model were borne disproportionately by women and children. Scholars began examining his political engagement more critically. He'd been vocal in his opposition to fascism, creating Guernica as a protest against the Spanish Civil War. He'd joined the Communist Party after World War II. These were brave positions, particularly given his fame. But his political commitment seemed selective. He'd used his platform to oppose certain injustices while remaining silent about others. His feminism, despite painting powerful women, never extended to treating actual women as equals. The contradictions were the point. He wasn't a saint or a villain. He was a brilliant artist and a flawed human, capable of extraordinary empathy in his work and remarkable selfishness in his life. Understanding him required accepting both truths, resisting the urge to simplify into hero or monster. The complexity was what made him interesting, what made his story worth examining beyond the legend. His influence on subsequent art movements remained visible everywhere. Abstract expressionism owed him an obvious debt, taking his fragmentation and making it larger and more gestural. Pop art responded to his celebrity, treating the artist as brand. Minimalism reacted against his maximalism, stripping away everything he'd added. Even when artists opposed his approach, they were defining themselves in relation to him. He remained the unavoidable reference point. But by the late 20th century, some younger artists began working as if he'd never existed. They drew from different traditions, looked to different sources, operated in different contexts, this was the ultimate sign of his influence becoming historical rather than contemporary. When artists no longer needed to respond to him, when his achievement became background rather than active force, it meant the era he'd defined was ending. Digital technology created new ways of engaging with his work. Museums developed interactive exhibits where visitors could explore paintings in extreme detail, zooming into brushstrokes invisible to the naked eye. Virtual reality experiences let people walk through reconstructed studios, seeing the spaces where he'd worked. Educational programs used his paintings to teach about history, politics, and social change. The work became accessible in ways that would have been impossible during his lifetime. Yet something was lost in digital reproduction. The physical presence of the paintings, their texture and scale, couldn't be fully captured by screens. Looking at a painting on a phone was fundamentally different from standing before the actual object. The materiality mattered. The fact that these were things made by human hands, that you could see the traces of that making, created a connection that technology couldn't replicate. His notebooks and sketches, preserved in various archives, revealed the thinking behind the finished works. Scholars pored over these documents, finding preliminary versions of famous compositions, abandoned ideas, technical experiments. The sketches showed that even his most radical innovations emerged from careful consideration. What looked spontaneous was often the result of extensive preparation. He'd explored possibilities before committing to final forms. The early rejection he'd faced became part of the mythology. Stories circulated about critics who'd dismissed his work, collectors who'd refused to buy, institutions that had rejected him. These stories served a purpose, proving that genius wasn't always immediately recognized, that innovation required time to be understood. But they also created false comfort, suggesting that rejection itself was proof of quality. Most rejected artists remained rejected because the work wasn't good. His eventual success was the exception, not the rule. Art historians began situating him within broader contexts. He wasn't working alone, but within networks of artists, dealers, collectors, critics. His achievement depended on systems of support that had nothing to do with individual genius. The galleries that showed his work, the collectors who bought it, the critics who praised it, all played essential roles. Stripping away the romantic myth of the isolated genius revealed something more interesting, a complex ecology that enabled innovation. The relationship between his work and African art received particular scrutiny. Early in his career, he'd been profoundly influenced by African masks, incorporating their forms into his paintings. But this appropriation was never acknowledged as debt. He'd taken freely from cultures that European colonialism had subjugated, transforming their aesthetic innovations into something he claimed as his own. This pattern of appropriation without credit reflected larger dynamics of cultural theft that characterized modernism, yet the influence was transformative. African art had helped him break from European traditions, offering alternative ways of representing form and space. The encounter was generative, producing work that couldn't have existed otherwise. The ethical question was whether this justified the appropriation, whether artistic innovation excused cultural theft. The answer seemed to be no, that acknowledging influence and compensating source cultures should have been possible, that genius didn't excuse exploitation. His ceramics received renewed attention. Late in life, he'd worked extensively in pottery, creating plates, vases, and sculptures that showed the same inventiveness as his paintings. The ceramics were playful, often depicting bulls, faces, or birds with quick, confident brushwork. They demonstrated that his creativity wasn't medium-specific. Give him any material, and he'd find ways to transform it. The graphic work, particularly his prints, proved more accessible than the paintings. Museums could afford to collect them, meaning more people could encounter his work directly. The prints showed his mastery of different techniques: etching, lithography, liner cut. Each medium brought out different aspects of his approach. The etchings were delicate and linear. The lithographs were bold and gestural. The liner cuts were flat and graphic. The range demonstrated technical virtuosity that extended beyond painting. Auction houses developed expertise in authenticating his work. With thousands of pieces in circulation, forgeries were common. Specialists examined brushwork, materials, provenance, using scientific analysis to determine authenticity. The stakes were enormous. A genuine painting could be worth millions, a forgery nothing. The authentication process became its own industry, with experts commanding substantial fees for their opinions. His estate controlled reproduction rights, licensing his images for everything from coffee mugs to t-shirts. This commercialization troubled some critics who felt it cheapened the work. Others argued it democratized access, letting people who'd never see the originals still engage with the images. The ubiquity of his work in commercial contexts meant his style became visual shorthand, recognizable even to people who knew nothing about art history. The villa where he'd spent his final years became a museum. Visitors could walk through rooms where he'd lived and worked, seeing the views that had surrounded him, the objects he'd collected. The space was modest, surprisingly ordinary for someone of his fame. The ordinariness was the point. He'd lived simply, dedicating resources to work rather than luxury. The house demonstrated that creativity didn't require grand surroundings. His correspondence with other artists revealed generosity alongside competitiveness. He'd encouraged younger artists, offering advice and support, but he'd also been fiercely protective of his position, viewing other artists as rivals. The letters showed someone fully human, capable of kindness and pettiness, secure in his achievement, yet constantly worried about his reputation. The sheer volume of his output remained staggering. Estimates suggested he'd created over 50,000 works across all media. Even accounting for sketches and minor pieces, the productivity was extraordinary. How had one person made so much? The answer seemed to be relentless work ethic combined with absolute commitment. He dedicated his life to making art, rarely taking breaks, constantly producing. The volume itself was part of the achievement. Critical reassessment continued. Some scholars argued his influence had been overstated, that other artists deserved more credit for modernism's development. Others defended his centrality, insisting his innovations remained unmatched. The debates were academic but not pointless. Understanding how art history gets written, whose contributions get remembered, and whose get forgotten, revealed power dynamics that shaped cultural memory. His legacy remained contested, complicated, impossible to summarize neatly. He'd changed art forever. He'd lived problematically. The work endured while the man receded. What remained were the paintings themselves, still demanding attention, still refusing simple interpretation, still mattering in ways that transcended fame and money and scandal. The art outlasted everything, which was perhaps exactly what he'd intended all along. The question of what his art actually meant became increasingly complex as interpretive frameworks evolved. Early critics had focused on formal innovation, analysing how he'd broken from representation. Later scholars emphasised psychological dimensions, reading the work as expression of inner turmoil. By the late 20th century, postmodern theorists were deconstructing the notion of authorial intention entirely, arguing the paintings meant whatever viewers brought to them. Each generation found different things in the same canvases. Some art historians attempted quantitative analysis, mapping the frequency of certain motifs across his career. Blue appeared most often in which periods? How many paintings included fragmented faces versus intact ones? The data revealed patterns, but patterns didn't explain meaning. A spike in angular forms during wartime might reflect external chaos, or might simply indicate aesthetic experimentation unrelated to historical events. The numbers couldn't distinguish correlation from causation. His treatment of women in the work drew increasing scrutiny from feminist scholars. The fragmented female bodies, the distorted faces, the reduction of women to visual elements, rather than full subjects. Critics argued this reflected broader misogyny, reducing women to objects for male artistic manipulation. Defenders countered that he'd fragmented everything equally, that male figures received similar treatment. The debate revealed how impossible it was to separate art from the social conditions of its creation. Museums faced practical challenges displaying his work. The paintings were physically large, requiring substantial wall space. They couldn't be grouped too densely without overwhelming viewers. But spread too thin, they lost impact. Curators experimented with different arrangements, testing how proximity affected perception. Hanging two paintings side by side created dialogue between them. Separating them by other works disrupted that conversation, but allowed each piece individual attention. Conservation efforts became increasingly sophisticated. Scientists analysed paint composition, identifying pigments he'd used and how they'd aged. Some colours had faded, others darkened. Restoration raised ethical questions. Should conservators try to return paintings to original appearance, or preserve them as they'd aged? Intervention risked damaging the work, but non-intervention meant continued deterioration. Each institution developed its own protocols, leading to inconsistencies across the collection. The market for his work remained volatile. Prices fluctuated based on factors beyond artistic merit. Economic conditions, collector trends, auction house marketing all influenced valuations. A painting might sell for twice its estimate, simply because two wealthy bidders wanted it badly enough. The financial dimension had nothing to do with the art itself, yet it shaped how the work was perceived. Expensive meant important in public consciousness, even when price reflected speculation rather than quality. His relationship with dealers had been pragmatic and sometimes contentious. He'd needed them to reach buyers, but resented their percentage. Letters revealed negotiations over prices, disputes about sales terms, frustration with the commercial apparatus required to sustain an artistic career. The correspondence humanized him, showing someone navigating practical realities rather than existing in pure creative realm. Photography of his work created its own complications. Reproductions could never capture the physical presence of the originals. The scale disappeared, the texture flattened, the colors shifted. Yet most people knew his work primarily through photographs. Art history textbooks, museum catalogues, internet images all mediated the experience. The reproduction became a substitute, shaping understanding based on inadequate information. Seeing an actual painting after years of knowing photographs often shocked viewers. The real thing looked different, felt different, demanded different attention. His influence on subsequent movements was both direct and indirect. Abstract expressionists cited him as precedent, pointing to his freedom with form and colour. Pop artists referenced him differently, appropriating his imagery while inverting his seriousness. Conceptual artists rejected his focus on visual aesthetics entirely, yet still defined themselves against his example. Even artists who claimed to work against his legacy were responding to it, unable to escape the gravitational pull of his achievement. Educational programs struggled to teach his work effectively. Children responded to the bright colours and strange shapes without needing theoretical frameworks. Adults often demanded explanation, wanting to understand what they were seeing. Teachers developed strategies for different audiences, emphasizing different aspects. For kids, the focus was playful engagement. For general public, accessible interpretation. For advanced students, complex analysis. The work accommodated all approaches while fully satisfying none. His studio practice became subject of intense study. Photographs showed the workspace, paint-splattered floors, works in progress leaning against walls. He'd worked on multiple pieces simultaneously, moving between canvases as inspiration struck. The simultaneity meant stylistic developments didn't follow neat chronology. He might return to earlier approaches while also pushing forward, creating temporal complexity that frustrated scholars seeking linear progression. Technical analysis revealed his process in forensic detail. X-rays showed underlayers, earlier compositions painted over. Infrared imaging detected preliminary sketches beneath finished surfaces. Chemical analysis identified paint sequences, which colours went down first. The scientific investigation uncovered evidence of constant revision, of paintings that had undergone multiple transformations before reaching final form. What looked spontaneous was often the result of extensive reworking. His writings on art theory added another interpretive layer. He'd published manifestos, essays, statements explaining his approach. But the writings were often contradictory, declaring principles he'd violate in practice. Whether the contradictions reflected evolving thinking or deliberate provocation remained unclear. Some scholars trusted the written statements as reliable guides to intention. Others dismissed them as marketing, focusing instead on the work itself as primary evidence. The psychological dimension of his biography invited speculation about connections between life and art. Had childhood experiences shaped his visual vocabulary? Did personal relationships influence specific works? Biographical critics drew links between documented events and stylistic shifts. Formalist critics rejected such connections as reductive, insisting the work transcended personal circumstance. The debate reflected broader disagreement about whether art should be understood through biography or independent of it. His political engagement complicated legacy assessment. He'd aligned with progressive causes, using fame to support movements he believed in, but critics noted contradictions between stated values and actual behaviour. The gap between public positions and private actions revealed someone more complex than his political statements suggested. The inconsistency was human, which made it no less troubling for those who wanted their artistic heroes morally uncomplicated. Museums organised retrospectives attempting comprehensive overview, but comprehensiveness proved impossible given the sheer volume of work. Curators selected representative pieces, knowing selection meant exclusion. Different institutions emphasised different periods, creating competing narratives. A show focusing on early work told one story. An exhibition highlighting late paintings told another. No single exhibition could contain the full range. His influence extended beyond visual arts into design, architecture, fashion. The angular forms and bold colours became stylistic vocabulary appropriated across disciplines. Designers referenced his aesthetic without necessarily understanding the theoretical framework. The visual language became detached from original context, circulating as pure style. This popularization troubled purists who felt it trivialized serious artistic achievement. Digital technology opened new ways to experience his work. Virtual museum tours let viewers examine paintings in extreme detail, zooming closer than possible in person. Augmented reality apps overlaid contextual information onto physical artworks. Interactive timelines mapped stylistic evolution. The digital tools enhanced access while also mediating it, inserting technological layer between viewer and object. Forgery detection became increasingly sophisticated as stakes rose. Scientific methods could analyze materials with precision impossible decades earlier. But forgers adapted using period-appropriate materials and techniques to fool tests. The arms race between authenticators and counterfeiters meant certainty remained elusive. Even works accepted as genuine for decades occasionally got reattributed following new analysis. His approach to colour theory influenced teaching for generations. Art schools incorporated his methods into curricula, training students to see relationships between hues. The pedagogical legacy meant his impact extended beyond people who'd seen his work, shaping how artists were educated worldwide. The influence was structural, embedded in institutional practices. The relationship between preliminary studies and finished works revealed his thought process. Sketches showed initial concepts, often quite different from final paintings. The evolution from sketch to completion demonstrated decision-making, what he'd kept and what he'd discarded. Studying the preparatory work was like watching thinking unfold, seeing options considered and rejected. His letters to family members showed a different person than public statements revealed. The private correspondence was warmer, more vulnerable, less concerned with maintaining reputation. He'd written about doubts, frustrations, small domestic concerns. The letters humanized him in ways the artwork couldn't, revealing someone recognizable rather than mythic. Exhibition catalogues became scholarly works in themselves, featuring essays by leading critics and historians. Each major show produced a substantial publication, contributing to the ever-growing literature. The catalogues served multiple functions: documentary record, critical analysis, marketing tool. They extended the exhibition's life beyond its physical duration, letting absent viewers engage with the presentation. His estate's decisions about lending works shaped public access. Some paintings remained in private collections, rarely exhibited, others toured constantly, becoming familiar through repeated viewing. The distribution wasn't equitable. Major museums in wealthy cities had regular access. Smaller institutions in less prominent locations saw his work rarely, if ever. The geography of access reflected broader inequalities in cultural resources. Conservation science developed partly in response to challenges his work presented. The unusual materials and techniques required new preservation methods. Research conducted on his paintings advanced the field generally, benefiting conservation of all modern art. The technical legacy extended beyond aesthetics into practical methodology. His notebooks contained fragments of ideas, some realized in paintings, others abandoned. The unrealized concepts offered glimpses of roads not taken, alternative directions his work might have followed. Scholars analyzed these fragments, speculating about what might have been. The speculation was ultimately futile but irresistible, imagining parallel versions of an already extraordinary career. The institutional structures supporting his legacy required constant maintenance. Foundations needed funding, museums needed resources, scholars needed grants. The infrastructure of remembrance was expensive, dependent on continued investment. Without it, even the most famous artist could slip toward obscurity. The organizational dimension of legacy was unglamorous but essential. His impact on art market infrastructure was substantial. The high prices his work commanded justified investment in authentication expertise, conservation facilities, secure storage. The economic value created ecosystem of specialists whose livelihoods depended on his continued relevance. The financial dimension was self-reinforcing. Value justified infrastructure. Infrastructure supported value. Critical backlash periodically emerged, questioning whether his reputation was deserved. Contrarian scholars argued for neglected contemporaries, suggesting historical accident rather than merit explained his prominence. The revisionist arguments rarely gained traction, but they served important function, preventing consensus from calcifying into dogma. Questioning established narratives kept art history vital rather than static. His work's presence in popular culture meant even people uninterested in art encountered his images. Films referenced his paintings, advertisements borrowed his style, memes circulated his imagery in ironic contexts. The cultural penetration exceeded that of almost any other artist. Whether this ubiquity enhanced or diminished serious engagement remained debatable. The physical spaces where his work hung became pilgrimage sites for devoted admirers. Certain museums attracted visitors specifically to see his paintings, with other collections almost incidental. The magnetism of the work created tourism infrastructure, supporting local economies. The economic impact of artistic legacy was measurable, quantifiable, sometimes surprising. His influence on color reproduction technology was unexpected but significant. Printers and publishers striving to accurately reproduce his paintings pushed technical boundaries, developing better processes that benefited all color printing. The practical legacy extended into realms far removed from fine art, affecting commercial printing, photography, digital display. Academic careers were built studying his work. Professors spent decades analyzing specific aspects, publishing books, teaching courses. The scholarly ecosystem sustained itself, each generation training the next. The intellectual infrastructure paralleled the institutional, creating networks of expertise that kept his work central to art historical discourse. His approach to composition influenced photography, film, graphic design. The way he structured visual space provided vocabulary other media borrowed. Cinematographers studied his paintings for lessons about framing. Photographers referenced his sense of balance. The cross-pollination between disciplines meant his impact exceeded painting alone. The mythology surrounding his personality sometimes overshadowed the work itself. Anecdotes about his eccentricities, his difficult relationships, his quotable statements became their own narrative, threatening to replace engagement with actual art. The biographical legend was compelling, but ultimately less important than the paintings, which mattered independent of who made them. His technical innovations became less visible as they were absorbed into standard practice. What seemed revolutionary when he introduced it became conventional wisdom within decades. The flattening of pictorial space, the emphasis on surface texture, the expressive use of color, all these once radical choices became assumptions subsequent artists worked from. The revolutionary became foundational, invisible through normalization. The question of whether he would remain relevant in coming centuries was unanswerable, but fascinating. Cultural memory was selective, brutal, subject to unpredictable shifts. Artists once considered immortal faded into obscurity. Forgotten figures were rediscovered, elevated. The mechanisms governing artistic reputation over centuries remained mysterious despite scholarly attempts at explanation. His work's appeal crossed cultural boundaries in ways that suggested something universal was present. Japanese collectors, Middle Eastern museums, Latin American scholars all found value in paintings created in specific European context. Whether this universality reflected genuine human commonality or Western cultural dominance was debated. The answer mattered less than the fact of continued engagement. The conservation challenges his work presented would intensify. Materials degraded, pigments faded, surfaces cracked. Each restoration decision involved judgment calls, balancing preservation with alteration. Future conservators would face increasingly difficult choices about intervention, weighing respect for original against practical necessity of preventing loss. His influence on color theory extended into unexpected domains. Interior designers referenced his palettes. Fashion designers drew inspiration from his combinations. The practical applications of artistic innovation spread far beyond gallery walls, affecting daily visual environment in subtle ways. Art's influence on life was diffuse but pervasive. The psychological impact of encountering his work in person remained powerful, despite reproduction's ubiquity. Standing before the actual canvas, perceiving the texture, scale, presence, the experience retained qualities photography couldn't capture. The distinction between reproduction and original mattered, preserving reason for pilgrimage to museums. His working methods influenced how art was taught. Studio practices emphasizing experimentation, accepting failure, working through multiple iterations. These pedagogical approaches trace back to his example. The educational legacy was practical, shaping how future generations learned craft alongside vision. The market for his work would remain strong, barring catastrophic economic collapse. The investment dimension was undeniable. Paintings functioning as stores of value, assets appreciating over time. The financial logic supporting his market position was robust, likely to persist through normal economic fluctuations. His correspondence revealed artists more complex than public image suggested. Letters showed self-doubt, financial anxiety, interpersonal struggles. The documented life complicated mythology, adding human dimension to genius narrative. The fuller picture made him more relatable without diminishing achievement. The influence on subsequent movements was traceable through specific artists who acknowledged debt. The lineage was documented, establishing clear genealogy of ideas. Some influence was direct, conscious borrowing. Other impact was atmospheric, absorbed through cultural osmosis. Both forms mattered, shaping artistic evolution. His work's presence in public collections ensured accessibility. Unlike privately held works, museum pieces could be studied, photographed, analysed. The democratic dimension of public ownership mattered, allowing scholarship and public engagement that private collections couldn't support. The critical vocabulary developed to describe his work became standard terminology. Phrases coined by early critics to capture specific qualities became common usage, shaping how everyone discussed not just his work but painting generally. The linguistic legacy was subtle but substantial, affecting discourse itself. His approach to subject matter influenced what was considered worthy of artistic attention, elevating mundane scenes, finding beauty in ordinary moments. This democratization of subject matter opened possibilities for others. The expansion of acceptable content was liberating, validating wider range of artistic choices. The technical difficulty of his work protected it from easy imitation. Attempting to copy his effects revealed how sophisticated his methods were. The barrier to replication maintained distinction between original and derivative work. Easy imitation would have diluted impact. Difficulty preserved value. His influence on art criticism was significant. Critics developed new frameworks for discussing his innovations, expanding critical vocabulary. The intellectual infrastructure built around his work enriched criticism generally, providing tools applicable beyond his specific case. The interdisciplinary connections his work enabled were valuable. Art historians collaborated with psychologists studying perception, chemists analysing pigments, historians contextualising cultural moment. The research generated extended beyond art history proper, contributing to multiple fields. His work's reproduction rights generated ongoing revenue supporting various institutions. Licensing fees from posters, books, merchandise-funded museums, scholarships, conservation work. The commercial dimension of legacy, often ignored, was practically important for supporting non-profit cultural institutions. The challenge facing future scholars was avoiding repetition while finding fresh insights. With centuries of analysis accumulated, discovering genuinely new perspectives became difficult. The scholarly imperative to contribute original knowledge pushed researchers toward increasingly specialized topics, sometimes losing sight of broader significance. His work's emotional accessibility remained despite theoretical complexity. Viewers without art historical knowledge could respond to paintings on purely affective level. The emotional directness coexisted with intellectual sophistication, allowing engagement at multiple levels simultaneously. The physical vulnerability of paintings created ongoing conservation challenges. Natural disasters, accidents, vandalism, the threats were numerous, requiring constant vigilance. Each loss diminished collective heritage, making preservation increasingly urgent as time passed. His influence on museum practice was substantial. Exhibition strategies, lighting choices, interpretive materials, all evolved partly in response to challenges his work presented. The institutional legacy shaped how museums functioned generally, affecting visitor experience across collections. The symbolic function his work served in cultural discourse extended beyond art world. References in literature, music, popular culture used his work as shorthand for artistic achievement generally. The symbolic utility was separate from aesthetic value, but contributed to sustained relevance. His works appealed to collectors, ensured continued market demand. Private collectors competed for available pieces, driving prices higher, ensuring financial value remained strong. The collector community was self-sustaining, with established collectors mentoring new ones, maintaining interest across generations. The question of whether his reputation would survive future cultural shifts was unanswerable, but worth considering. Dramatic revaluations happened regularly in art history. Artists once dismissed as minor became major. Reputations once solid crumbled. The mechanisms governing long-term survival were mysterious. His technical achievement was measurable, quantifiable in ways that transcended subjective judgment. The mastery of medium was demonstrable, providing foundation for reputation independent of changing tastes. Technical excellence was more durable than stylistic preference, offering stable basis for continued recognition. The influence on art education ensured exposure for future generations. Students studied his work in survey courses, learning art history through his examples. The pedagogical role was self-perpetuating, each generation teaching the next, maintaining place in curriculum. His work's presence in digital collections extended access globally. Virtual museums allowed people anywhere to study high-resolution images, democratizing access previously limited to those who could travel. The digital dimension was transformative, changing relationship between art and audience fundamentally. The critical debates his work generated remained productive. Scholars disagreed about interpretation, meaning, significance. The ongoing debate kept work vital rather than settled, preventing calcification into unquestioned canon. Controversy was healthy, indicating continued relevance. His influence on color science was documented. Physicists and psychologists studying human color perception referenced his work, finding empirical correlates for artistic choices. The intersection of art and science was mutually enriching, each discipline informing the other. The economic infrastructure supporting his legacy required constant attention. Auction houses needed experts, museums needed curators, publishers needed editors. The employment created by cultural memory was substantial, supporting livelihoods across multiple professions. His work's ability to generate new interpretations suggested inexhaustible richness. Each generation found different meanings, projecting contemporary concerns while engaging genuine qualities of work. The interpretive flexibility was strength, allowing relevance across changing contexts. The preservation technology available for his work improved constantly. New imaging techniques revealed underdrawings, previous compositions, technical processes invisible to naked eye. Scientific analysis enriched understanding, providing information unavailable to earlier scholars. His influence on photography was underappreciated but significant. Photographers borrowed compositional strategies, studied his use of light, learned from his handling of space. The cross-medium influence demonstrated how artistic insights transcended specific materials. The mythology surrounding his life would persist regardless of biographical accuracy. The narrative was compelling, independent of factual precision. Whether stories were true mattered less than their cultural function, providing framework for understanding creative process. His work's presence in public imagination meant references appeared in unexpected contexts. Cartoons, advertisements, casual conversation. The cultural penetration was broad, indicating integration into shared visual vocabulary. The challenge for museums was keeping displays fresh while respecting masterpieces. Rotating exhibitions, new interpretive approaches, innovative programming, all attempted to prevent familiarity from breeding indifference. The curatorial challenge was ongoing. His technical notebooks, when deciphered, revealed artists constantly experimenting. Failed attempts, abandoned approaches, alternative strategies. The documentation showed creative process was messy, uncertain, exploratory, rather than inevitable march toward finished work. The influence on graphic design was traceable through specific practitioners who cited his work. Layout strategies, color relationships, compositional balance, principles from his paintings informed commercial art, affecting visual environment beyond gallery context. His work's auction records attracted media attention, generating publicity that maintained public awareness. The financial news was superficial engagement, but kept names circulating, preventing slide into obscurity that claimed less commercially successful artists. The academic industry built around his work was self-sustaining. Conferences, journals, research grants, the scholarly infrastructure generated ongoing activity, ensuring continued study regardless of broader cultural trends. His influence on animation was surprising but documented. Animators studied his sense of movement, his compositional dynamics, his color relationships. The lessons applied across media, demonstrating universality of visual principles. The physical spaces his work occupied became important secondary to the work itself. Museums gained prestige from housing his paintings. Cities promoted themselves through collections. The cultural capital was significant, affecting tourism, civic identity, institutional reputation. His work's reproduction in educational materials ensured exposure for young people. Textbooks, online courses, documentary films. The educational presence meant each generation encountered his work during formation, establishing baseline familiarity. The conservation community developed specialized expertise around his materials and techniques. The knowledge was valuable beyond his specific case, informing treatment of contemporaneous works. The technical legacy extended through conservation practice. His influence on theatrical design was documented. Set designers referenced his spatial arrangements. Lighting designers studied his tonal relationships. The cross-disciplinary influence affected performing arts, demonstrating how visual principles transcended specific contexts. The question of whether his work would remain accessible to future viewers was important. Cultural context shifted, making historical work increasingly opaque. Without interpretive framework, paintings could become mere decoration, losing meaning. Education was essential for sustained engagement. His work's presence in private homes through reproductions meant millions encountered images daily. The domestic familiarity was different from museum experience, but contributed to cultural saturation, making work an inescapable part of visual environment. The critical frameworks developed for analyzing his work became applicable to contemporary artists. The vocabulary created to describe his innovations served present needs, demonstrating how historical study informed current practice. His influence on fashion illustration was specific and traceable. The stylization, the emphasis on surface, the decorative impulse, all found echoes in commercial art serving fashion industry. The connection between fine and commercial art was bidirectional, mutually influential. The archival materials related to his life grew constantly as scholars discovered new letters, documents, photographs. The expanding archive required management, creating ongoing institutional needs. The documentary legacy was substantial, supporting research across disciplines. His work's ability to surprise even familiar viewers suggested depth that rewarded repeated attention. The paintings weren't exhausted by single viewing, revealing new aspects with each encounter. The richness was genuine, not projected by viewers desperate to find meaning. The influence on urban planning was indirect but real. City beautification efforts referenced his sense of visual harmony. Public arts programs drew inspiration from his integration of art into everyday spaces. The civic legacy was diffuse but meaningful. His work represented specific historical moments while transcending it. The paintings were products of particular time and place, yet spoke beyond those origins. The balance between specificity and universality was delicate, essential to sustained relevance. The future was uncertain, but the past was clear. He had changed how people saw, thought, felt. The work remained, solid, undeniable, waiting for whoever came next to discover what it meant for them. The paintings hang in museums across the world. They're photographed, studied, debated, bought, sold. They generate tourism revenue and scholarly dissertations. They appear on coffee mugs and in college textbooks. The images have been reproduced so many times they've become wallpaper, background noise in the visual culture we swim through daily. But strip all that away. The money, the fame, the institutions, the mythology, what remains? Canvas and paint, marks made by human hands, decisions about where to place a line, what colour to use, how to structure space. Thousands of those decisions accumulated over decades, creating objects that still demand attention when you stand in front of them. The work endures because it solved problems that mattered. How do you show multiple viewpoints simultaneously? How do you paint not what you see, but what you know? How do you make a flat surface contain depth without pretending to be a window? These weren't theoretical exercises. They were urgent questions about the nature of seeing itself. Every artist since has worked in the world he helped create. The assumption that painting doesn't have to represent reality, that it can be about form and colour and structure, that it can fragment and reassemble according to its own logic. These are his gifts, so thoroughly absorbed they've become invisible. The personal failures matter. The exploitation, the appropriation, the cruelty. They don't disappear just because the work was important. Future engagement with his legacy will have to hold both truths simultaneously. Genius doesn't excuse harm. Achievement doesn't erase damage. The complexity is the point. But the paintings themselves, independent of who made them or how they were made, still work. They still create the shock of seeing something familiar made strange. They still demonstrate that reality can be taken apart and rebuilt according to different rules. They still prove that human creativity can generate forms that didn't exist before someone imagined them into being. Standing in front of a canvas he made over a century ago, you're encountering something that refuses to be passive. The painting looks back. It makes demands. It won't let you coast through the experience on autopilot. That aggressiveness, that insistence on being seen on its own terms rather than yours, is what keeps the work alive. The market will fluctuate. Critical frameworks will shift. Cultural priorities will change. Some of this is predictable. Most isn't. What survives depends on forces beyond anyone's control. Reputation is fragile, subject to reversals that seem obvious in hindsight but are invisible in the moment. What matters is that the work exists. It's documentation of what one human mind discovered about form, colour, space, seeing. The discoveries weren't inevitable. Someone else might have found different answers, taken different paths. But this particular set of solutions, preserved in paint on canvas, changed what became possible. The influence will fade eventually. Everything does. Cultural memory is finite, selective, brutal. Future generations will have their own concerns, their own heroes, their own ways of seeing. The paintings that seem essential now might become curiosities, interesting mainly to specialists, footnotes in a story that's moved past them. Or they might not. Some work transcends its moment, speaking across centuries to people who share nothing with the culture that created it. Whether his paintings have that quality won't be known for generations. We're too close, too embedded in the structures his work helped create to judge objectively. What we can say is this: for a century after his death, the work continued generating meaning, provoking responses, inspiring both devotion and critique. It remained vital rather than becoming merely historical. That's not nothing. Most art doesn't last a decade past its maker's death. His lasted 10 times that and showed no signs of exhaustion. The paintings are objects in the world, physical things made from materials that decay. They require protection, conservation, institutional support. Without constant care, they'll deteriorate and eventually disappear. Nothing lasts forever. The question is whether they last long enough to matter, to shape how people see, to change what becomes possible. They already have. Whether they continue depends on choices future generations make about what's worth preserving, what's worth studying, what's worth passing on. The work can't advocate for itself. It can only exist, waiting to be seen or ignored. He made things that didn't exist before. Some of those things changed how we understand what painting can be, what art can do, how reality can be represented. The change was profound enough that we're still living inside it, still working through implications that haven't been fully explored. That's the legacy, not the auction prices or the museum attendance or the scholarly publications, the actual thing, the expansion of possibility, the demonstration that reality isn't fixed, that it can be taken apart and rebuilt according to different logic, that seeing isn't passive but active, that the mind constructs what the eye encounters. These insights seem obvious now. They weren't obvious before. Someone had to discover them, prove them, make them visible. That's what the paintings do. They're evidence of discoveries that changed the territory they explored. The man who made them is gone. The world he lived in is gone. But the paintings remain, solid, undeniable, still demanding to be seen, still refusing to be merely decorative, still insisting that looking requires thinking, that seeing requires work, that art isn't decoration but investigation. Whether that matters to you depends on what you think art is for. If it's background, something pleasant to glance at while thinking about other things, then most of this is irrelevant. But if you think art can show us something we wouldn't otherwise see, can make visible what was hidden, can reorganize reality in ways that reveal new truths, then his work remains essential. Not because of who made it, because of what it does. The paintings still work. That's what survives. Not the reputation, not the prices, not the mythology. The actual objects, doing what they were made to do, showing us the world taken apart and rebuilt according to different rules, making us see differently, think differently, understand that reality isn't fixed but constructed. That's the inheritance, not a style to imitate or a career to emulate. A way of seeing, a set of tools for taking apart what seems solid and discovering it's made of choices, not necessities. The freedom to rebuild according to your own logic rather than accepting what you were given. The paintings hang in their museums, behind their security systems, viewed by their crowds. They've become institutions themselves, part of the infrastructure of culture. But occasionally, someone stands in front of one and actually sees it. Not the famous painting by the famous artist, the actual thing, the marks on canvas, the structure underneath, the intelligence organizing chaos into form. When that happens, when the seeing is genuine rather than dutiful, the work does what it was made to do. It changes how the viewer understands what they're looking at. It reorganizes their sense of what's possible. It demonstrates that reality can be questioned, taken apart, rebuilt. That's why it matters. Not because of historical importance or market value or institutional prestige, because the work still works, still shows us something we wouldn't see otherwise, still proves that seeing isn't passive, that reality isn't fixed, that human creativity can generate forms that didn't exist until someone imagined them. The rest is noise. The biography, the scandals, the prices, the debates. They're interesting, sometimes important, but ultimately peripheral. The core is the work itself. What it does, what it shows, what it makes possible. He's been dead 50 years. The work remains, doing what it's always done, refusing to be ignored, demanding attention, making us see differently, whether we want to or not. That's the only legacy that matters, the only one that lasts.